So just a quick introduction. David Folkerts-Landau on my left, Group Chief Economist and Global Head of Research at Deutsche Bank. He's not only a banker, he taught at Chicago Business School and also worked for the International Monetary Fund in Washington. And Tim Jackson, you saw him in the film, he is a Professor of Sustainable Development at the University of Surrey in England. He's a member of the Club of Rome, and he was on the UK Sustainable Development Commission. I'd like to start off with Tim Jackson, and also again going back to Scaramucci and his his vision, where he's saying in the future we might be taking asteroids on Earth and develop new cancer treatments and so on. So what is so wrong with that idea? Why is it bad?
I don't think there's anything wrong with developing new cancer treatments and even possibly thinking about resources that are available in places that we don't at the moment think of. But other than that, I think the reverse question is more appropriate. What is there that's right about Scaramucci's vision? I mean, he's a funny man. He makes interesting jokes about filmmakers and about the world in general, but his humor is directed in such a fashion that I think it's deeply socially unpalatable, and he doesn't see the limits of the planet. He doesn't see the impacts of the financial system on the poorest people in the world. He doesn't really have a care for the integrity of government, and the model of capitalism that he is a kind of high priest for is one that has not just degraded the planet and created increased inequality, it has undermined the security of the financial system. He can only hold that position on the understanding that when everything gets screwed up, there is something there to save them, as there was through the financial crisis. That something is public finance, it's government, it's the savings of ordinary people that get trashed when Scaramucci and his colleagues get the sums wrong.
So, David Folkerts-Landau, you are part of the financial system. Do you share Scaramucci's vision? Have you dealt with him professionally?
No.
But you know him?
No great interest either. Let me just take a second to kind of lay out my thoughts in response to the film. One of the greatest achievements of mankind was to come out of 1,000 years of misery. The Roman Empire fell in 476. After that, we had 1,000 or 1,200 years of absolutely wretched misery. We lived very close to animals. And then, in the 15th, 16th century, something happened. We don't quite know what. It's one of the great mysteries of development as to why all of a sudden did development pick up. But from there on out, from 1750 on to today, it's almost been an exponential growth. Two reasons for that, in terms of broad, what made it successful. One is democracy. We moved from an absolute monarchy, gradually, step by step, in Germany only in the 1920s, but in the UK a lot earlier, from an absolute monarchy to a representative democracy. At the same time, we developed property rights and markets, prices, the idea that a price system could allocate resources. Those two things are responsible for, in a very broad sense, for where we are today. Think for a second, if you had lived in the 17th century, you probably would have felt, well, things are okay, they're getting better, and why should they get a lot better? You would have no conceivable idea as to what was going to happen in the 19th century. In fact, if you had predicted what would have happened, they probably would have burned you on the stakes for being a witch or something. Likewise, if you were sitting in the 18th century, looking ahead to the 19th century, you have zero idea that there's going to be trains, there's going to be canals, there's going to be mass production of goods. Now put yourself only as far as 1950. Would you have foreseen the IT revolution? Would you have seen that on my iPhone here, I can control the temperature in my apartment in London? Or that I can communicate with my children at school? Or that I can have a chat group, I'm interested in mathematics, about Ramanujan, with a bunch of a dozen mathematicians around the world? No, you couldn't have. So I would urge great caution in terms of thinking what we can see 50 years out. In fact, we're quite stupid as far as that's concerned. And there's a bias in this. We always underestimate how things can be, what we can develop, what we can innovate, what we can figure out. So from that point of view, I would think that there's a certain amount of optimism we should have in where the world is going. Just one more minute, if I may. Now, This development was interrupted by what I call the doomsayers, okay? We had Malthus, Reverend Malthus. He stood in churches like this and gave great speeches about population going exponential and food production going linear, and every 50 years we have a crisis. Pustekuchen, nothing happened, okay? Basically, it didn't work because the food production way outstripped population growth, so it wasn't a problem. Then we had the Club of Rome, who had very similar ideas that the population would outstrip resources. Well, resources today are more plentiful than they've ever been. We don't have a resource problem. We don't. Then they thought that environment would become so decrepit and degraded that we couldn't live anymore. Well, that's not true either. Our environment's better now than then. Now we have global warming. So it sort of keeps going like that. You see the pattern here, and the evolution, technical development outstrips the doomsayers step by step. That's just sort of as an introduction.
Okay, now you have to. Now you. So
we could spend so long here on this conversation. So let me, where to start? I mean, let's agree on the fact that the Enlightenment, science, civilization brought us wonderful things. Let's just agree on that. And let's also agree that there are parts of the world which desperately need even basic sanitation, water, access to energy supplies, clean energy supplies, and good nutrition. We can agree on all of that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the model of capitalism and growth that the advanced economies are still pursuing is going to take us towards some bright, shiny future. And you talk about the Club of Rome, and everyone trashes the Club of Rome's work. It was 50 years ago, this year, this month almost, that the Club of Rome was founded. And the extraordinary thing about the Limits to Growth report was that every subsequent study that's looked at their predictions in terms of resources has shown exactly the same pattern that they were showing. And that pattern does predict not that resources have already run out by the millennium and that we can't possibly have a future, but rather that over time, a society which continually depletes its resources and degrades its environment is headed for an overshoot and potentially a collapse. And if you look across ecological systems, even if you look across anthropological systems, you'll find myriads of examples of societies that collapsed through transcending the environmental and indeed the social limits that those societies were constructed around. There's a wonderful biologist called Van Valen who said that the success of a species in getting to a certain point in time, however long that is no indicator at all of the likely success of that species into the future. So against that sort of wonderful vision of we have technology, we have innovation, and I absolutely applaud that, we have to set a little bit of hubris, a little bit of humility, a little bit of a sense actually that the environmental situation that we've created, the social conditions that are emerging, and even the health of the financial and economic system itself have been desperately undermined by this form of capitalism.
I'd like to, yeah. I'd like to disentangle this a bit. So you were saying, you know, the resources wasn't a problem, and you're saying it might be a problem. The question, of course, is: do we need resources to have growth, or could we think of models of growth that are not as resource intensive as the ones we have seen in the 19th century or in the 18th or in the 20th century? Could that be a solution out of the dilemma, right? So we grow, but we use less resources. Who wants to?
I think this whole conversation about whether we should grow or not grow is completely bogus because it focuses on one variable, GDP growth, and that's nonsense. GDP growth is just, in technical terms, a sufficient statistic for the well-being of a society. It includes the innovations in medical devices, it includes medical technology, it includes all kinds of other innovations, anything that uses goods that we can measure in services. So don't worry about growth, worry about the development, the well-being, and that is very closely correlated in advanced economies to GDP. So governments don't focus on GDP. Government focus on your well-being, the well-being of the electorate. So I think that's kind of a bogus notion created by the propaganda machine of people who kind of don't like it. But it isn't really so. Ultimately, you slightly misstated what I was saying. For me, when I look at the broad sweep of history, I see this fabulous development, and at every stage I see that we were wrong about what was going to happen. So I submit to you, yes, there are a lot of problems, but let's not forget that we are really quite stupid. We were wrong about it in the past. Perhaps we're wrong about it again in the future. Now, if you want to stop global warming, and you want to hit the 2% limit that has been agreed, you will have to have such an immense impact on today's society and today's economies that we run a risk of very seriously jeopardizing the progress that we have had over the last 100 years. There is no other way around that. Now, the question is, my view is, given the uncertainty over the next 50 years in terms of innovations in carbon capture and lots of other things, do we really want to jeopardize our societies, and you're all well to do here, in order to kind of get a little bit more certainty about that 50 years from now, so that our great-grandchildren might have less risk? For me, the answer is no.
For you?
Again, it's kind of strange to be on a platform with someone when I agree with almost everything, and yet somehow it had a twist on it that I can't quite get my head around. And I absolutely agree about the transition to a low-carbon society. I mean, it's one of the things. I've been working on that for 30 years, and I absolutely agree that that transition, the transition that was agreed in Paris 3 years ago to limit global warming to well under 2 degrees and hopefully 1.5 degrees. That requires a transition, an enormous transition in our economic structure, in our institutions, in our industrial infrastructure, in the way that we produce energy, and that it is absolutely essential to think clearly about how we achieve that transition. The difficulty is that if your economy is continually expanding, and indeed the thrust of all of your policy is to keep that expansion going, then you have to run faster and faster and faster in terms of your decarbonization to achieve those targets. And there is a secondary risk there, in fact, possibly even the primary risk, which is something that we have looked at, that I have over 30 years of experience in trying to talk about low-carbon technologies, witnessed on a day-to-day basis, that these are not priorities within a policy domain and a business culture that thinks that growth is the primary goal. And there I think I would absolutely agree with you that GDP is just a measure. It's another 50th anniversary this year of a speech by Robert Kennedy that made exactly the same point. The GDP does not measure. It measures everything, he said, except that which makes life worthwhile. But try telling that to political decision makers who are actually putting in place policies specifically engineered to pursue growth at the expense of the fairness of supply chains, the impacts on the environment, and indeed the stability of the financial system itself.
I spend a fair amount of time talking to CEOs around the world, CFOs, including here in Germany, Mittelstand, and other firms, and I am deeply impressed with, one, the concern for the environment. It is cool to be green. And green we will all be. So there is no question here that anybody who wants to set up a dirty business is not going to be successful with its shareholders. Certainly, I would say in Germany, probably ranked #1 in that. You cannot go anywhere and sell somebody a dirty investment or tell an alliance to invest in dirty companies. The whole thinking about green is organically taking place within German industry, within the German press, as we just saw. And so I'm very hopeful that these things will come by themselves. And a little bit of price setting in terms of raising taxes on dirty industries and oil and so will be a good thing. My view is that I do not want to have somebody tell me, don't go in the store and buy yourself a second iPhone. Don't go and buy more toys for the kids. Don't go and buy more stuff. Because if you start preventing us from doing those small things we like to buy, even though they're probably not socially useful, you may do real damage to the innovative process. Where have the biggest innovations come from? Military and games. When you look at the big video chips that have been produced, that are being used in place now, they started with production for games, Sony and others. So I know there's criticism about we're using too much stuff. I like my stuff. I like my iPhones, and I like all those things. They've made my life so much more comfortable. I don't have to be in my office now. I can be on my farm in Ostfriesland, watching the wheat grow, and manage what is $400 million research business. So all of those things were just not possible, and they are possible now. And that's a great thing. Let's not allow a group of people who think they know better from jeopardizing that.
You get your...
Do I get to reply?
Yeah, one second. I just want to put a little bit of water in the wine of the German economy and the ecological thinking we have around. I mean, you're right, I would say, but still Germany is not going to achieve its climate change goals this year. And if you look at what's going on in the automotive industry, there are also some doubts how ecological they really are. But I'll get the general point. Now your reply.
That sounded very speechless, didn't it? I'm not. I have too many thoughts, I think. But actually, one of them is that I don't think it's right to demonize innovation, and I don't see that a different organization of society would demonize innovation. In fact, the iPhone that you want the update of, actually almost all of the technology in that was developed by public funding from the US government. It wasn't necessarily developed in a cutthroat environment of endless competition in pursuit of growth by corporate endeavors. It was certainly certain that some of those corporations profited from that research and that innovation, but innovation itself is in the spirit of human beings. It's in the heart of society. That's not something that we have to give up or throw away, but clearly what we have to think very seriously about is whether everyone, 8 billion people, approaching 8 billion people, 10 billion people by the middle of the century, can all have a farm and an update on their iPhone and a yacht in the Caribbean and the lifestyle of a Scaramucci. And it's absolutely clear to me that the physical resources available do not extend within a carbon budget, within a resource budget, to that sense of what the good life is. And I think that, to me, brings the most important misunderstanding of this of all, is that we have equated GDP growth, material growth, and the accumulation of stuff with the idea of prosperity. Any informed understanding of what prosperity is within human beings immediately gives the lie to that. We are not simply acquisitive, selfish, individualistic, hedonistic consumers. There are other parts to our life, and they are getting trashed by an obsession with growth.
We are not we are not exclusively, but we are also individualistic.
Of course.
So in your model, who gets to decide who gets the iPhone? I know we have it. Do the people in Africa, are they allowed to have an iPhone and a car?
Absolutely. We are not in a position to say to people in Africa, sorry, you cannot. We're not in a position to tell them anything, to be perfectly frank, but certainly not that they cannot grow their incomes, they cannot have decent nutrition.
So you need someone who allocates the resources to the...
To me, this is very precisely a responsibility of the most advanced economies in the world. We've done enough kind of preaching to the less developed parts of the world, and we've done too little taking responsibility for where we are in the progress of human society, where we are in the development of this model. And it seems to me, actually, that we are at a position where, for moral reasons, for environmental reasons, for reasons of social stability, for reasons of political stability, we have to begin to think seriously beyond this growth-based model of capitalism. And there are alternatives. The conversation with Florian earlier, absolutely clear. They're not on the table, they're not off the shelf. We can't immediately say, yes, we're going to move from capitalism to some other ism. But actually, the idea of a better quality of life, living better with less, is something that a myriad of examples show us from all around the world. And one of the most interesting findings from those examples is that when people begin to live with these moral constraints in mind, and with this simplicity, and with this sense that prosperity extends beyond materialism, they find a degree of measurable well-being that is not there in the general population.
So you're basically saying that we should grow less so that the less developed countries can grow more. Is that a model you could subscribe to?
The CO2, carbon dioxide output of the US since 1965, that's up in the air, it's roughly about 250 trillion metric tons. That of the European Union is roughly 220, China roughly 180. So all same order of magnitude, right? And everything else is just very small. Now, the current flow production of carbon dioxide, which is the main global warming agent, Asia Pac is double of Europe and the US together. In order for us to allow them to get to a developmental stage where we are, we basically would have to go back into the Stone Age. This is nicely to say that we should compensate for what the Chinese and Asia Pac is doing, but it is just impossible within the economic system that we have. And within a political system, remember, we have one person, one vote. You try to do it, next thing, this is going to be a church full of AfD people. So there is just a huge constraint here. And the big political problem in global warming is not to get us adopt different production techniques. That's easy, okay, and bring it down a little bit. In fact, carbon dioxide is going down rather than up. It is how to persuade the rest of the world to come along, and it's an unsolved issue. I don't know what to do about it, but that is sort of, in a nutshell, the principal issue that I see as far as global warming is concerned. The global coordination. Just because the Chinese signed the Paris Treaty doesn't mean a thing. In the end, it's an undemocratic country that is going to do what it can to get economic development up to our standards, and that is an existential problem.
So, I mean,
that's an interesting challenge. I mean, I think it's right that there is a political challenge, but it's absolutely wrong that we are the ones who are leading, pulling the laggards behind us. The rate of decarbonization in China and the fast industrializing countries is the only thing that's keeping the decarbonization of the world going at the moment. The rate of decarbonization in advanced economies has slowed down over the last decade. We are not any longer leading the pack in terms of addressing the problem of global warming.
I would invite the audience to look at the statistics. The CO2 output of China and Asia Pac is more than double the total output of US and the UN. It's a matter of fact.
I promise we will do a story in ZEIT, and you can already be able to check the facts and provide you with the figures. I want to go to a possible solution out of this dilemma, right? So if you're saying, I mean, you don't say, but let's just assume, you know, we are not going to grow as quickly as we did in the past, right, because we can't, we must not, or because we cannot. Or one solution, of course, would be redistribution, right? If the cake stays the same, let's give a larger part of the cake to the many and take it from the rich. Would that be a way out of that dilemma?
Yeah, I think we have to think not just about redistribution, but about predistribution, about the distribution of assets in the first place, and the way in which the economic system divides the surplus from production between those who own those assets and the people, ordinary people who work in factories and offices and in the government. And what's very clear from the last 10, 20 years of the history of capitalism is that balance has shifted very much in the favor of the minority that have that ownership of the assets. That is something that has to be reversed, I think, mainly for political and social reasons, because it's totally untenable.
There's an important misconception here, and that is, growth is not the policy variable. Growth is the outcome of everything else we do. Growth is an endogenous variable. So you say we don't particularly care about growth going down. It doesn't. I was interested in the movie when somebody said there was sort of a visceral fear about growth going down. It isn't. There is no visceral fear of growth going down. There's a visceral fear of our living standards, of our medical care, our care for the aged, our food supply, that going down, yes. But we don't mind if GDP, instead of being 5%, grows at 2% or even grows at 1%. We do care if that leads to lots of unemployment, lots of sick people not getting care. So that's number one. As far as the redistribution is concerned, I completely agree with Tim on this. I think that on the first part of the statement, that the unequal distribution of income of capital that has resulted from the financial crisis is abhorrent. I think it is just unbelievable that the group of people that benefited from the financial crisis now also has benefited from the resolution of the crisis. If you're an equity holder, you are twice as well off now as you were before the crisis. There's something wrong with that, okay? Now, but that's not for us to sit here.
Except for you have an equity holder of Deutsche Bank, then.
Yeah, well, then you do a social service, okay? You volunteer.
Sorry.
There is something wrong with that. Now, how do you fix that? Well, that's why we have governments. That's why we can all go and vote. And we can put tax systems in place. And we have capital gains tax and all of those things that we can do in a non-distorting way. It doesn't mean that we have to have a new system with a new ism kind of rearranging everything. So there are easy ways to fix that. As far as this is globally concerned, we are nationalists in the sense that we think that we cannot extend power beyond our borders. There's nothing you can do to Nigeria, one of the fastest growing in terms of population country, which will have the biggest carbon footprint. Can we go in and say, you got to get rid of the government and get a democratic government and have property rights? No, we can't. So that's a huge inefficiency in a global economy which should be addressed. If I may just finish. The single most important constraint that I see is not the constraint on resources, but it is a political constraint. That if we move too fast, undermining the way things currently are in terms of coping with an immigration issue by spending money, we will get the wrong people in government. And so to sit here and say we should do redistribution of income, we should have less growth and perhaps tolerate a little bit more unemployment, maybe do some work sharing. And so the group of people that can vote may not like that. And that would be a real catastrophe. So you always have to think in terms of, if you put something in place, in terms of the political constraints. And when I watch these debates from the Greens and the environmentalists, I say to myself, no, what are these guys smoking? I mean, you cannot put those things in place without worrying about the political constraint, which unfortunately we have, and Germany in particular, but also in the US, it's just horrendous what is happening. But that's because free trade was great. It was great for me, for you, and for you. But it wasn't great for the opioid-addicted guy in Kentucky. And he has his revenge. His revenge is the ballot box. And we need to be very, very afraid of that.
Yes. Yeah, we should be afraid of political instability, but we should also be sanguine about some of its roots. Again, there's a point of agreement. Let's let go of the GDP. There's no policy which says we go to a dial with the G word on it and we turn it down and we tell people that's where we live. But if we begin to build an economy in which enterprise works for people, in which people work for their society, in which investment actually commits to the future, in which the money system is seen as a social good, then we have the foundations for addressing all of those problems, including the problems of the environment and of social stability. The one thing that stands in the way of us putting together sensible policies in all of those areas is that almost fetish of GDP and growth. And I absolutely accept that there are places where that fetish is not evident, but I'm also painfully aware from my own experience, actually, that is the political reaction to any questioning of a post-growth or a non-growing or even a lower-growing society. And one of the most interesting lessons over the last 10 years, in fact, is that we may just have to get used to that idea, because the growth rate in advanced economies is declining of its own accord since, in fact, about the mid-1970s and 60s. And it wasn't to do with the financial crisis. What we tried to do before the financial crisis was to keep that growth rate going again. We tried with Keynesianism, with government stimulus. We tried with monetarism, making money more freely available. We tried with deregulation of the financial system. All that led to was the collapse of the very system that was supposed to provide growth. And what we're looking at now, I think, is a long-term secular trend of declining growth rates, and governments who are unable to look that in the face and say what comes next are going to be the casualties of the future.
If I may respond for a second. Sure. The decline in the growth rate is a wonderful thing. It is nothing to be afraid of. Let me ask you the following. as your income has grown from when you were a student to where you are now, your consumption pattern has completely changed. The same thing is true of our economies. In the 70s, we were still very much an industrial economy. The economy was heavy. It had cars and steel and all those things. Today, we're no longer that. We have moved to a knowledge economy, to an innovative, more spiritual knowledge kind of economy with much less emphasis on the heavy things in the economy. That results in a lower growth rate. But that's a good thing. We shouldn't be afraid of it, and we are not afraid of that. So I think this sort of bogeyman that's been created that, oh, gee, you know, the government's trying to keep the growth rate up there, and if it isn't up there, they get all panicky. This is not the reality in which I live, and I travel in and out of Berlin as much as anybody here. It's just not the way people think. We think about welfare, about voters who vote, and sometimes we use GDP as a proxy for that. So we have to be kind of careful in not getting hitched on to these concepts and bogeymen that have been created for us because they're not.
I would like to stop to end the session with another episode out of the film at a later stage, where you see the head of Airbus in China. Yeah. He's sitting in his car, and they're driving down the road in Beijing, and then he tells Florian, you know, in the old days there was only bicycles. It was really bad, and you know, look around, there's cars all over the place. And of course, the problem is that there are so many cars that they are not moving. So actually, they're stuck in a big traffic jam. And he would probably be faster had he ridden his bicycle. Yeah. So to both of you, what does this episode, what conclusion do you draw from this episode? What does it tell you about the system we live in? Yours?
Oh, the first thing it does...
Build more roads or about...
No. It will cure itself. In fact, it has cured itself. I'm in China twice a year. And when I first arrived in 1982 as part of the IMF mission that brought China into the IMF, there was, like, you know, as Katie Malua says, there was 9 million bicycles in Beijing. It was just huge, nothing but bicycles. You go, and then there was nothing but cars. Now, traffic has been controlled, access has been controlled, and sort of those are the maturation process that an economy goes through. We can pretty much map out what's going to happen in China. It's going to jump over a few steps that we had to go through, but by and large, economies mature, and they produce less of the heavy industrial stuff like cars. I don't even have a car anymore. I haven't had a car for the last 15 years. Why? Because I use Uber. And so these kind of sharing things is something that is a new way of going forward. Let me just say one more thing. I know we're being singled here, it's time. From where I sit, we are entering sort of a third revolution. In a sense, we had industrial revolution, we had the IT revolution. We are moving into a robotics and time-saving revolution that is almost inconceivable. It's very, very hard to see forward. The most important thing that I have and that you have is what? It's not money. It's our leisure time. And so, and how many tasks in the course of the day do you do that you say, I don't want to do this? Do I want to polish my shoes? No, I don't want to do that. All those things that you don't want to do over the next 20 years will be done by a robot, will be done by some mechanical device that has to be produced. So it is a fabulous world that is emerging. And that's where economies go to. Less traffic, we don't travel that much anymore, fewer airplanes, and all those things. And that's kind of what is in the back of this, the way these economies are developing. It's not about growth, it's about that kind of progress.
Right, thanks. So this is the solution. The system will take care of this of itself, and it will be resolved. It will get resolved. What do you make out of this?
I applaud that the heroicism of that vision. There are aspects of it that I find deeply uncomfortable. I actually kind of would like to be able to polish my shoes occasionally and work in society.
You're doing fine.
You think?
Yeah.
I did notice a spot earlier, but it's. I would simply plead, I suppose, and I'm absolutely. I mean, it's fantastic to be on the stage with the chief economist of Deutsche Bank saying GDP doesn't matter. It's not about material growth. It's about the quality of our lives. I don't have any agreement with you, David, about that. I would simply appeal, I suppose, to an imperative to create some of the institutions that protect our social values and our ecological values, the quality of society itself, the distribution of resources between rich and poor, what it means to have a kind of more contemplative spiritual life rather than a material one. It's absolutely clear we can't go to any other country in the world, even industrializing, fast industrializing countries like China, and preach dematerialization to them. That's absolutely clear to me. What we can do actually is reflect on our own position in that as advanced economies and put in place the institutions that protect society.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for this fascinating debate. Big applause for our panelists. And I switch into German again. Thank you.